Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Coughlin, and welcome to First Person Civil War Podcast, which retells the stories of the soldiers and officers on the ground in the battles of the Civil War. Episode 32 is entitled First Lieutenant C. Seton Fleming and the 2nd Florida at the Battle of Williamsburg, and relies on his book, published by his brother, Francis P. Fleming, in 1884, entitled Memoir of Captain C. Seton Fleming of the 2nd Florida Infantry, CSA. Charles Seton Fleming was born just north of the city of Jacksonville, Florida, in 1839. With roots in Ireland and Scotland, the Fleming family claim to fame was an ancestral marriage into the family of King Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland in the early 1300s, who led the war against England after William Wallace's death. C. Seton Fleming desired a career in the military and sought an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He was unsuccessful in this endeavor and instead attended Kings Mountain Military School in Yorkville, South Carolina, from 1858 to 1859. As Florida and several other states seceded from the Union, C. Seton Fleming showed his enthusiasm for the impending war with a letter dated 23 January 1861 to his brother Francis, who was surveying in southern Florida and was unaware of the crisis beset upon the nation. The first gun, may be of a long war, has been fired. It was discharged by the South Carolina troops on Morris Island, near the entrance of Charleston Harbor, at a United States steamship. The ship was the Star of the West, and he continues, which had on board troops to reinforce Fort Sumter. After receiving 6 or 8 shots, some of which struck her, she was driven back without accomplishing her object. Georgia has taken Fort Pulaski and has a large garrison in it. Several of the fortifications at Pensacola have also been taken, besides those at Mobile and some in Louisiana, all of which were in the hands of the secessionists by last accounts. The Jacksonville Light Infantry and some of the citizens are erecting a battery at the bar. After Florida passed the Ordinance of Secession on 10 January 1861, C. Seton Fleming joined a local company called the Minutemen and drilled with them for a time. By April of that year, it became clear that the Minutemen would remain around Jacksonville, Florida, and instead of staying in this unit, he assisted in raising Company G of the 2nd Florida Infantry. On 13 July 1861, he was mustered into service with Company G with the rank of First Lieutenant. First Lieutenant Fleming and his brother Francis, a private in Company H of the 2nd Florida, were sent to Virginia and arrived at Richmond on 21 July 1861, which was the day of the First Battle of Bull Run. The 2nd Florida was eventually assigned to the defenses around Yorktown, Virginia, as the Union Army of the Potomac, under the command of Major General McClellan, prepared for its advance upon Richmond from the coast. The 2nd Florida saw its first taste of action on the skirmish line at Yorktown, but retreated along with the rest of the army up the peninsula. It was at the town of Williamsburg that the Union pursuit caught up with the Confederates. At this point in the war, the 2nd Florida was the only regiment from that state in Virginia, as all others either stayed within Florida or were sent to the Western armies. This meant that the 2nd Florida was known as a representative regiment of the state. And after retreating from Yorktown, the 2nd Florida marched in Brigadier General Jubal A. Early's brigade, in Major General D. H. Hill's division of the Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by General Joseph E. Johnston. On the evening of 4 May 1862, First Lieutenant Fleming, the 2nd Florida, and the rest of their brigade had marched through Williamsburg and were in readiness to continue the march on the 5th. By that morning, the Union Army caught up with the Confederate rear guard on the east side of the town. The retreat toward Richmond was slow going, and Major General D.H. Hill's entire division had yet to depart when it was ordered to turn around and march to the ring of redoubts on the southeast side of Williamsburg. The Confederate forces at Williamsburg on 5 May were approximately 3 divisions of infantry and 1 brigade of cavalry, under the tactical command of Major General James Longstreet, who was the senior division commander on the field. His division was the first to engage the advancing Union Third Corps. As the battle continued to develop, Major General Longstreet discovered that the forces he already sent into the fight were running low on ammunition. At 3:30, I received messages from some of the brigadiers that their ammunition was getting short. Ours being in wagons and therefore unavailable, my only means of furnishing it was to get fresh troops. I consequently sent to Major General Hill for the balance of his division. Colston's brigade and 2 regiments of Early's brigade were ordered forward through the woods at our right. First Lieutenant Fleming, the 2nd Florida, alongside the 12th Mississippi Battalion, received these orders and advanced beyond Fort Magruder toward the Union lines. The 2nd Florida, on reaching the scene of action, was halted to load and then thrown into line of battle, and in this, their first engagement, advanced with the steadiness of veterans across an open field, under heavy fire from the enemy, who were posted in strong force in a fallen wood beyond. As the regiment advanced, they witnessed the gallant cavalry charge of the Jeff Davis Legion. But the experience of this arm of the service against well-drilled infantry is almost universally the same. This proved no exception to the rule, and many an empty saddle bore silent witness to the valor of the unfortunate trooper. As the 2nd Florida advanced toward the Union lines in the woods south of the fortifications, the 38th New York, commanded by Colonel J. H. Hobart, maneuvered into position to meet them. On arriving near the front, under the direction of General Birney, my regiment filed to the right of the road into the woods, and then deployed in open order, fronting the enemy's works in the vicinity of Williamsburg. General Birney had, in the meantime, formed the 40th New York in our rear as support. The general now directed me to advance cautiously to the edge of the woods, but not to advance in the open field beyond, and not to fire unless they could hit. But after driving the enemy from the woods, to hold my position until further orders. I accordingly advanced, and in obedience to orders, drove the enemy from the woods. As the enemy retreated across the open space and road, I continued to drive them. The 38th and 40th New York's advance was in conjunction with another brigade on their left flank, and Private Francis Fleming noted that it was this combination of a flank attack and the loss of their commander that forced the regiment to retreat. On reaching the fallen timber, the advancing lines of the 2nd Florida were halted and opened fire. Almost immediately after Colonel Ward fell, it became apparent that the enemy were flanking the Confederate right. The regiment was therefore ordered to fall back, which was done across the field over which the advance had been made, where they reformed, having been thrown into some confusion in falling back under a heavy fire. The regiment was then advanced to a position along an old line of fence, almost midway of the field. The 38th and 40th New York regiments pursued the Floridians and Mississippians, but seemed to stop short of where the 2nd Florida had just retreated. As the line stabilized, First Lieutenant Fleming volunteered alongside 10 other men to venture to their old position and attempt to recover the body of Colonel Ward. This was fraught with great danger, the party having to advance in the face of a steady fire from the enemy. They reached the body, however, in safety, and taking it up, proceeded to bear it toward the Confederate lines, when Lieutenant Fleming was shot down, the ball entering just above and in front of his right hip, passing through the body and making its exit at the center of the back. Captain COL and others attempted to take up their wounded comrade and bear him in, but he would not permit it, every movement of the body causing him great pain. Supposing himself mortally wounded, he said to them, "Leave me, and let me die in peace." The remainder of the party returned to the regiment. When Francis learned that his brother was left wounded between the lines, he immediately organized a party to retrieve him, but was told to wait until evening when the firing slackened. In the meantime, Lieutenant Fleming, having somewhat revived from the first shock of his wound, managed, by great effort, to drag himself a short distance toward the regiment, waving his sword, and was discovered and brought in. It was about sunset, and the rider, with volunteers from Stark's company, took the wounded man on a blanket, and afterward on a litter, to carry him to Williamsburg for medical assistance. The Battle of Williamsburg was inconclusive, with the Confederate retreat and Union pursuit continuing up the peninsula toward Richmond. The Confederate wounded from the Battle of Williamsburg stayed in the town that night, and many, like First Lieutenant Fleming, were not evacuated before the Union Army seized the town. In a letter to his parents, dated 9 August 1862, First Lieutenant Fleming recounted what happened to him after his capture. The Yankees, who came in town next morning, did not have me removed to a hospital, but let me remain at the same house, where I was indeed very lucky to get, for the lady who stayed there was just as kind and attentive to me as though I was her own and only child. There was nothing that I wanted that was not gotten for me, if it could be had in town. I was confined to my bed for about 7 weeks, during which time I suffered more from fever than the actual pain that my wound occasioned. While First Lieutenant Fleming recovered from his wounds in Williamsburg, the 2nd Florida held regimental elections. The regiment's initial term of enlistment was only for 1 year, but just before the Peninsula Campaign began, the Confederate Congress passed legislation that extended their enlistment by 2 more years. As a trade-off, the regiment was allowed to hold an officers' election. This was set for 3 May 1862, but was delayed because of the siege of Yorktown. As the regiment camped somewhere along the banks of the Chickahominy River, they held elections. Though wounded and absent from the 2nd Florida, First Lieutenant Fleming remained on the ballot for elections, and as a result, garnered a number of votes. As there was no guarantee of his brother's return, Francis intervened. With the great uncertainty as to the fate of Lieutenant Fleming, the probability that his wound would prove mortal, and remembering with gratitude the generous offer of Captain COL, his rival candidate for majority, at the great risk of his life to accompany the party to his assistance on the field of Williamsburg, the author thought it best to remove the name of Lieutenant Fleming as a candidate. The reorganization of the regiment was, therefore, effected without his election to an office. When First Lieutenant Fleming recovered from his wounds, the town was still under Union control, and he was sent further down the peninsula to be with Confederate prisoners from the ongoing campaign. As soon as I got well enough to be sent away from Williamsburg, I was sent to Fort Monroe, and from there, Fort Wool, commonly known as the Rip Raps, which is an artificial island at the mouth of Hampton Roads, made by depositing rocks there for the purpose of building a fort upon. There was a strict guard kept over us. Our fare was salt meat, bread, and coffee, but the coffee was not fit to drink, and our beds consisted of 1 blanket each. It was no very pleasant thing to be a prisoner, but such is the result of war, and we must take our chances. On 5 August 1862, First Lieutenant Fleming was exchanged and returned to the 2nd Florida. On 15 August, he received a promotion to captain and took command of Company G at the Battle of 2nd Manassas, when its commander was killed in action. Captain Fleming remained with the 2nd Florida from 1862 until 3 June 1864, when he was shot and killed while on the picket line at the Battle of Cold Harbor. Though Francis P. Fleming published his brother's book, Memoir of Captain C. Seton Fleming of the 2nd Florida Infantry, CSA, in 1884, his initial purpose of organizing his brother's memoirs were for his friends and family to read. Upon perusal, however, of the manuscript, as originally prepared by those in whose judgment I repose confidence, it was suggested to me that it would interest not only the survivors, as well as the friends and relatives of those who were actors in the scenes through which we are taken, as we follow the last 3 years of the life which I have endeavored to portray, but that interest would be shared by a large number of the people of the state, who cannot but feel a pride in the record made by the Florida troops in Virginia. Thank you for listening to the 32nd episode. The link to First Lieutenant Fleming's book is now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find a sketch of C. Seton Fleming as a captain in the 2nd Florida. Over the past week, I have updated the format of the homepage, so if you do not have access to any of these social media accounts, you can find the pictures of the soldiers at that location. While there, please consider supporting the podcast by following the Support Podcast link at the top of the page. Any contributions are welcome, and payments are secured by the Clover Network. In 2 weeks' time, Captain William H. Chamberlain of Company C, 81st Ohio, provides next episode's first-person account at the Second Battle of Corinth. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.